a 1950s traditionalist on post-liberalism. In his book, Why Post-Liberalism Failed, Deneen cites the wane of prosperity in current society to argue that liberalism can no longer yield the fruits it once did. According to him, future generations seem to have fewer opportunities, and the public shows a deep mistrust and cynicism on all sides of government. Elections are regarded as rigged products of corrupt systems, and a growing gap between the wealthy haves and the unwealthy have-nots. Growing numbers of Christians compare our times to that of the late Roman Empire and ponder a fundamental withdrawal from wider American society into updated forms of Benedictine monastic communities. Here, Deneen presents the collection of voices that desire to eliminate a thoroughly integrated society in favor of a more withdrawn, unique community. One of these Christian voices is that Deneen describes is Rod Dreher, who precisely articulates the monastic withdrawal from larger society in his book, The Benedict Option, as a backdoor from liberalism's burning house. In the book, Dreher calls for a return to traditionalist education and thought, and he refers to traditionalist authors such as C.S. Lewis. Specifically, he refers to C.S. Lewis's work, The Abolition of Man, to build a case against the homogenization of the individual in the current society. One could reasonably see how Lewis might follow a train of thought that would call back to more traditional views. His series, The Chronicles of Narnia, was a pointed philosophical tool for introducing younger minds to classical and traditional forays from the likes of Plato, Dante, Milton, and especially the Bible. However, even though Deneen and Dreher are motivated by traditionalist material to sustain their arguments, and he would have agreed on many of the problems that post-liberalists present, C.S. Lewis himself would not have neatly attributed all these problems to liberalism. This paper will demonstrate that while it might seem that C.S. Lewis would support the version of post-liberalism put forth by Patrick Deneen and Rod Dreher, he would in fact take issue with calling for a radical end to liberalism. Established in the 18th century, classical liberalism stemmed from the prior century's theorists such as John Locke, and engaged with the Enlightenment during the birth of the new American nation. The Encyclopedia of Liberalism defines classical liberalism as a political ideology and branch of liberalism that advocates for civil liberties under the rule of law with an emphasis on limited government, economic freedom, along with a free market, political freedom, and cultural liberalism. Deneen responds, in practice, liberalism generates titanic inequality, enforces uniformity and homogeneity, fosters material and spiritual degradation, and undermines freedom. Its success can be measured by its achievement of the opposite of what we believed it would achieve. The reader can see how Deneen accuses liberalism of failing to execute the principal objectives for which it was meant. Instead of protecting the individual, Deneen claims that liberalism enforces homogeneity. Rather than providing economic freedom, the free market has fostered material degradation. Deneen even goes so far as to say that liberalism undermines freedom itself. In this case, the freedom Deneen speaks of might be distinguished a little differently from the contemporary definition of freedom. Up till now, Deneen has only presented the charges held against liberalism and is yet to indicate how liberalism has ceded its original purposes. One way he does this is by describing this alternate version of freedom as being free from slavish hedonistic desires, as opposed to being allowed the unpunished option to do anything one pleases. Deneen maintains that, if left unchecked, liberalism, which is coming fast to its end, shall give way to one of two possibilities. In the first form, liberalism will gradually resort to enforcing liberal order by edict, specifically in the shape of an executive government managed by a subgroup of leaders who disregard democracy, a frighteningly massive deep state with a long-reaching power of surveillance, official mandate, enforcement, and bureaucratic control. The second possible regime to replace liberalism is just as concerning for the reader, as Deneen describes some form of populist nationalist authoritarianism or military autocracy in order to deal with the anger and fear of post-liberal citizenry. Deneen's path out of liberalism is described in the final chapter of his book as tentative. However, he does lay out these steps as a bare outline, which will be summarized here. First, the achievements of liberalism must be recognized and built upon while abandoning the reasons for its failures. Secondly, society must outgrow the age of ideologies and instead develop practices that foster new forms of culture. Third and finally, if the first two steps are followed, then it is possible that a new political theory of thought may emerge. While the third step is vague and possibly several generations from realization, The first and second steps are already being visualized by post-liberals such as Rod Dreher in the book The Benedict Option. Starting by taking a step back from ideologies and fashioning new and smaller communities after the rule of St. Benedict of Nursia, Dreher describes a way of life that would fit Denin's alternative version of freedom mentioned before. Certainly, monks acting under the rule of St. Benedict practiced self-governing freedom. Dreher's restoration of the American soul is the same thing that Denin calls for in the first two steps to allow thought to spring forth, which may replace liberalism eventually. Dreher explains that the best way to drive out totalitarianism externally is to start internally, which he admits might not have the effect of turning the nation around, would at least serve to provide an unintentional political witness to secular culture. Dreher tells his audience not to be so shocked by the simplicity of the task. This is politics at its most profound level, Dreher says. It is politics during wartime, and we are fighting nothing less than a culture war over what C.S. Lewis called the abolition of man. What Dreher is referring to is C.S. Lewis's book by the same title, and particularly one chapter titled Men Without Chests, in which Lewis tackles moral subjectivism on the grounds that there are some natural laws with which humans must be educated, and take the drive to make everything subjective would rear men without chests. Lewis even goes on to write a dystopian novel, That Hideous Strength, in which powerful groups of politicians use subjectivism to make weak, powerless people while they continue forward with their own specific desires. I do not have the time to dive into this in this presentation, but I do welcome questions on that afterwards. Heavily influenced by traditionalists like Lewis, it makes sense that much of the ideas described by Denin and Dreher are well represented in Lewis's work, like That Hideous Strength, or even The Chronicles of Narnia. But to get a better understanding of how Lewis applies his idea of hierarchies in his fiction, one should understand what Lewis has explicitly to say on the topic in an essay titled Equality. In this essay, Lewis describes democracy as a salve for fallen mankind and maintains that there is a danger in defending democracy on the grounds of humanity's goodness. To Lewis, when equality is treated as an ideal rather than medicine, he states to maintain egalitarianism externally, mankind must preserve hierarchy internally. I think it is intrinsically good and beautiful as the nakedness of Adam and Eve. It was rightly taken away because man became bad and abused it. To attempt to restore it now would be the same error as the nudists. But medicine is not food. There is no spiritual sustenance in flat equality. He compares equality to clothing, important since humanity has lost its innocence, but of no spiritual significance itself. According to Lewis, the lack of sustenance mentioned here is the reason why there must be an internal preservation for hierarchy. He compares the need of the spiritual nature to a physical hunger. Deny it food and it will gobble poison. What he means here is the lack of honor for the appropriate target will cause mankind to foolishly honor, and I quote, millionaires, athletes, film stars instead, even famous prostitutes or gangsters. One needs to not think for too long before such societal targets of such worship reveal themselves in the reader's mind. Readers of Denin would draw the connection to Denin's idea of freedom. In Lewis's opinion, striving for the removal of authority comes from an inner inferiority. As Lewis puts it, this is the special disease of democracy and must be safeguarded against. Hierarchy within can alone support egalitarianism without. Let us wear equality, but let us undress every night. And so Lewis celebrates hierarchy in his own personal way by crafting Narnia, with the qualifier that the hierarchy is maintained by Aslan the Theocrat. All throughout the series, Aslan is the executive chief in appointing the kings and queens of Narnia. Early in the series, The Magician's Nephew, when Aslan founds Narnia, he ordains the first monarchs, King Frank and Queen Helen. Lewis goes on in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and coronates... In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Aslan coronates the Pevensey children who are divinely prophesied to be the ones who sit on the throne, the two high kings and the two high queens of Narnia. Finally, when the rightful heir to the throne comes into question in Prince Caspian, the old bloodline is blotted out by the Telmarines. It isn't until Aslan reappoints Caspian as the rightful monarch that the hierarchy is considered accomplished. The hierarchical structure is well established throughout the history of this fiction that Lewis crafts. However, Lewis does include within Narnia those who would come to hate the hierarchy and resent any superiority in others. As Lewis would put it, who would say, "I am as good as you." These examples can be found all throughout the Chronicles of Narnia and is important when considering that Lewis's opinion may be when considering post-liberalism. The first example is from the magician's nephew. The witch Jadis shows many times that she has no desire to bend the knee to anyone, but the most significant scene is when the protagonist Diggory comes into the garden with a mission from Aslan to pluck one fruit only from the tree in the midst of the garden and return it to him. She is seen wiping the dark juice away from her mouth and tossing it to the ground in spite of a sign warning that the fruit is only to be carried away by others. She then tries to tempt Diggory to do the same, or else take the fruit back to his dying mother on the basis that it will heal her rather than return it to Aslan. She says, "And it will be well, and you will be happy again, and you will be like the other boys." Observe Lewis's argument echoed, "I'm as good as you." She continues, "What has the lion ever done for you, that you should be his slave?" Here the witch demonstrates her hatred for the superior Aslan. Upon first seeing him earlier, she calmly states that she has found her doom. Because of her view, that's all he can ever be to her. And her inability to subjugate herself to him, she destroys herself even so. But Jadis is a villain. And while there are many villains in the Narnia saga which demonstrate this principle, Lewis takes it upon himself to make it so that all are susceptible to this pitfall. Take, for instance, in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where Caspian and Edmund begin to fight over the Isle of Goldwater. They begin to make cases against each other on the basis of who was more powerful. "Who are you talking to?" says Edmund. "I'm no subject of yours. If anything, it's the other way around." Here, as the hierarchy falls apart, Caspian clashes against Edmund, and the audience can hear the resentment in Caspian's almost saying the familiar "I'm as good as you" cry. This happens again later on in the same novel on the Isle of Duffers. The Duffers were a small population of dwarves placed in subjugation to the wizard Coriakin. The Duffers, in their resentment to the wizard, disobeyed him often, and when he transformed them physically into monopods, they demanded that they be turned invisible. They place all their trust into their self-appointed chief Duffer, who is described as being awfully conceited. When Lucy meets Coriakin, she asks him, "Don't they admire you?" "Oh, not me," said the magician. "They wouldn't admire me." And because they believe that they know better than to be led by the wizard, they remain unhappy and resentful for all of his guidance. As Lewis works hierarchy into his fantasy, one can see that hierarchy being set by God isn't enough to rule the world alone if the world has imperfect people, and therefore hierarchy is only to work with the involvement of a creator. The deity steps in to overthrow tyrants or keep good kings in line, and when it looks like evil is about to win the battle, Aslan intervenes in overthrowing the White Witch, saving King Rilian from his own madness, and dethroning the tyrant Miraz. Each step of the way through his saga, Aslan watches over the hierarchy and is lovingly involved. And in many cases, which unfortunately I don't have the time to go over in this presentation, he intervenes. The fact that even in a hierarchical world based on tradition, sent by an all-good, all-powerful deity, Lewis still felt the need to depict that deity as intervening when things got problematic, puts Lewis in a strange relationship with post-liberalism. Surely Lewis would openly agree to Deneen and Dreher's issues with modern society. However, this paper does not conclude that Lewis would find fault with the liberal system, but rather the individual on which the liberal system is based on. Even in a theocracy, there will be dissenters. For this reason, he says in his essay Equality, it would be a wicked folly to restore these old inequalities on the legal or external plane. Let us wear equality, but let us undress every night. Thank you so much.